Portion of this video is brought to you by Trendmicro.
What you doing, John?
Trying to get some shots of the moon on the S23 Ultra while it's out during the day.
Oh, nice. Let me see if my 14 Pro can do that.
I'm sure it can.
I'm not seeing anything. What does yours look like? Whoa! What is that? What?
Samsung Zoom might be a little, let's say too good to be true. But what the phone can do overall is not. And we're gonna talk a lot about it. And the Samsung brings a ton to the table, so does the iPhone. This is one of my favorite times of year we get to compare these two flagships. Now it's a bummer that they don't come out at the exact same time, so it's apples to apples, so to speak. But when the iPhone 15 does come out, we'll update this and do a fresh comparison. But for now, let's compare the two heavyweights, the flagship kings, the iPhone 14 Pro/Pro Max, and the Galaxy S23 Ultra. And as in past years, I'm not gonna cop out, there will be a winner. So before everybody's bias comes into play, it's blind camera test time. This is the best way to get an even playing field here. We're talking a lot about cameras. They're a big part of these phones, not the only part of these phones. But look at A, look at B. Look at both of these pictures here. They're obviously really good, and they're really good for a reason. But look at things that matter, the little details. Look at things like color temperature. Look how it's handling color representation. Look how the lowlights are being shown. Look how the highlights are being shown. The little things that add up to make a really good photograph. On the portrait mode shot, look how it handles cutouts, how the bokeh effect is done. These are obviously really good cameras, but it might surprise you which one was which. So let me know in the comments before I tell you if you got it right. But A is the S23 Ultra and B is the iPhone 14 Pro. So in the past, these phones I think have been really neck and neck, especially the past 3 years when it comes to photo quality. Typically with the iPhone edging out Samsung. This year though, it feels like Samsung took 2 steps gigantic forwards, whereas the iPhone maybe just took 1. It's not that the iPhone photos look bad, not at all, but it wasn't as huge a step from the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max. In some scenarios, it's arguably worse than last year's phone. S23 Ultra made gigantic improvements to the processing, like huge leaps. And if you look at the S23 Ultra versus the S22 Ultra on paper, there's not much to see, not a gigantic difference. When you start using these phones, you can really see the steps that Samsung made below the surface. Samsung's photos, for example, are bringing shadows up to show details without muddying up the rest of the exposure or colors. You get the detail throughout the entire image as crisp, it's sharp, it's bright, and in typical Samsung fashion, it's vibrant. The iPhone, again, still taking great photos. They feel a little bit more dull and flat in comparison to the S23's pictures. And Apple's choice to process their photos slightly cooler the last few years, I don't think has been the best choice. I really like the warmer take on photos they used to have. Samsung has sort of stepped in and skewed their processing slightly warmer, and they found a really nice balance between the two. In all fairness, obviously this is my opinion, which phone takes the better photos. However, there are a few things about these cameras that are objectively better, and that comes down to camera hardware. So both phones are sporting sort of the usual cameras. You've got a main lens, telephoto, ultra wide lenses. Apple's main camera has had a huge jump actually to 48 megapixels, which is more than enough to take incredible photos, especially when you add in Apple's ProRAW mode, where I think this camera really shines. And if you're a person who edits photos, this is a feature that you are going to want. I think that's part of the reason Apple's photos tend to look a little flatter. You can go in and bring out kind of whatever you want if you want to go through and do that work on the editing. However, 48 megapixels is nothing compared to Samsung's 200 megapixel main sensor. And you can't quite see the effect and benefit of 200 megapixels until you start zooming in on a photo you've taken with it. And as you can see, the difference between 48 megapixels and 200 megapixels is huge. It's actually, by my keen math, over 4 times. While the iPhone maintains a good amount of detail, and the image on the iPhone kind of falls apart a little faster than what Samsung does, especially when you start to zoom in on the shots. And there's a counter argument there that megapixels don't matter too much unless you're blowing up an image or doing a huge amount of zoom. If you are just looking at these pictures just straight out of the camera, the 4 times difference or over 4 times certainly matters a little bit less. So not only that, the S23 Ultra still has their signature 100 times zoom, where you can literally take a photo of the moon and see details in the crater. Try to do the same thing with the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and get this. Photos are one thing, but video is recently becoming a more and more important part of at least how I'm using my phone, and maybe you guys too. The iPhone has just always been the video king when it came to any smartphone out there. So the HDR video up to 4K 60 FPS, it looks amazing. There's detail where you want it, and it looks good just right out of the camera. Plus the 14 Pro still has ProRes video support as well. It's not a feature that I use that much because the file size is just gigantic, but it is there if you want to use it. And the quality with ProRes is substantially better than last year, and having that option is really nice if you want it. No one, not even Samsung, is doing RAW on a phone better than Apple. I think that is just an objective fact at this point. Samsung's phones, especially the past couple of years, video always came with a caveat. It's the best on the Android side, with sort of the iPhone being a giant elephant in the room. I think it's easy to argue that Samsung has now caught up to the iPhone and even surpassed it in some ways when it comes to video. Now, that is not saying how video is going to look in your third-party social media apps. So, TikTok and Instagram, a lot of that has to do with how those apps are processing video, but just straight from the phone, how the video looks. Samsung has improved year over year, and while Samsung wants you to believe, all the credit should go to them, I think the real people to thank for that is Qualcomm. The new Snapdragon chipset inside is doing the heavy lifting on photo and video. And they've just let Qualcomm do their thing instead of Samsung trying to do the processing on their own like they have the past few years. If you haven't felt it already, I'm clearly leaning towards Samsung as the winner on the camera side, which is kind of a strange thing to say. Taking all biases out and all OS allegiances out, outside of Pro RAW, Samsung has just done it better than Apple this year. But there's a lot more to what makes up a smartphone experience than just their cameras. The biggest versus, I think, for anybody out there is gonna be software. It's gonna be whether you are iOS, whether you are Android, whichever side of that fence you are sitting on. If you are ensconced in the Apple ecosystem, you need iMessage, you need AirDrop, you need iCloud, you probably already know where you're going to be. Android, if you want the openness, customization, you know where you are going to be as well. But no matter which side you decide to go with, you want to keep your software and your OS secure. And one of the best ways to do that is this video's sponsor, trendmicro. So you've probably heard of trendmicro, the one of those trusted names in software security, but the premium security suite gives you the best of everything they offer, from desktop to mobile. And as somebody who's been doing a lot of traveling recently, connecting to public Wi-Fi, to hotel Wi-Fi, always makes me really nervous. Inside of trendmicro's premium security suite, you've got their VPN called Proxy One Pro. It's going to turn any public hotspot into a secure Wi-Fi connection, give you peace of mind, and most importantly, keeping your data secure. It's when all you're there. It's also going to encrypt communication once connected to ensure privacy. So anything you are doing is going to be safe. It's also going to protect you from yourself and block dangerous, malicious websites. But beyond that, you're also gonna get dark web monitoring. You're gonna get a password manager built in, personal help desk to help you with any technical questions you might have, and just a full sort of security suite that you can be used on up to 10 devices each. So no matter what side you're on, if you're on iOS, if you're on Android, a Mac or PC, trendmicro is gonna keep your devices, and most importantly, your information on those devices secure and with you. If this sounds like something you want to check out and save 10%, use the code JOHN10 at checkout to have all the information that you need down below. Cameras tend to be the leading factor people are deciding which phone to get, but I've been saying it for years, it's the screen. When you go out and buy a TV, the quality of that screen is your primary concern. When your phone is basically all screen, how good that display is, at least for, I think, should be a just gigantic priority. So both these phones are rocking 120 hertz OLED displays, and I'm glad to see this become standard for these premium models. S23 Ultra's display still has the 1750 nit brightness in there, actually same as the S22 Ultra. And the iPhone 14 Pro display can go up to 1600 nits, but push it to 2000 when it detects a really bright environment. Basing it on numbers, the iPhone edged out Samsung in max brightness outdoors, but like, paper doesn't matter. Real life is what matters. The S23 Ultra looks brighter to my eye outside. And that's because the iPhone doesn't push the max 2000 nits all that often. But unless these phones are side by side, you really notice no difference whatsoever. They both get plenty bright. No matter which phone you've got, you're never gonna have really a hard time seeing what's on the display outdoors. One of the big selling points for the iPhone 14 Pro was their always-on display. When Apple launched the phones, always-on display was just a less bright version of your home screen, and that was a joke. We waited so many years for an always-on display that just drained your battery and looked like your phone was still on. Now Apple pivoted, to their credit. We now have an always-on display that, if we're being honest, certainly mimics what Android has had for years. Now I use the always-on display on the Apple side. I've always used it for years on the Samsung side. Just a small point. It's nice to see that become mainstream, especially across all sort of flagship smartphones. So the brightness and the always-on display aside, the iPhone S23 Ultra displays are really similar in the absolute best ways possible. Color contrast, vibrancy, it is all there. Where they differ though is still up front with the camera cutout. So we got Dynamic Island on the iPhone 15 Pro, which really to me seemed like a gimmick at first. I'm actually surprised how often I'm using it. My use case is really sports scores, keeping up to date on Laker games as they're going, and be able to just look at the phone and see it is awesome to have. And you can mimic something similar on the Android side. You could have widgets set up to do that. I love having it on the iPhone. On the camera cutouts on Samsung side, you still have a hole punch. It looks fine. It's been the same sort of design there for years, but 100 out of 100 times, I'll pick Dynamic Island over the hole punch. Not to mention the security that you get with FaceID. So other differences, aside from the camera cutout shape, is obviously the design. These phones look different. The iPhone is the same hardware that we've seen for a while, and you can love or hate it. That one is basically the same iPhone design, aside from the camera bump size. S23 Ultra at least appears to be the same design as previous years. Until you pick the sucker up, you realize Samsung has flattened out the edges of the phone ever so slightly, but that makes a gigantic difference when holding the phone. Now they obviously just throw a case on any phone, and really none of this particularly matters at all. But if you are one of the brave souls who uses their phones caseless, this will matter to you. So the rest of this phone is the exact same argument that you always get between Samsung and the iPhone. Do you want Face ID? Do you want the best ultrasonic fingerprint sensor out there? Do you want a huge battery and fast charging? Do you want MagSafe, A16, Snapdragon 8 Gen 2? Everything here feels fast. The big question is probably, do you want iOS or Android? That's sort of what these always tend to come down to. And at this point, you know the answer. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, but they are what makes these phones unique from each other. And listen, we are comparing a Lamborghini and a Ferrari at this point. These phones are very expensive and at the peak of their respective game. There is no bad choice when it comes to these devices. But if I have both of these on a table, and if you have both of these on a table and trying to pick which one to get, and assuming you have no S allegiance, I'm picking up the S23 Ultra this year. I think Samsung's done an absolutely incredible job with this phone. In all fairness, it's almost 6 months newer than the iPhone. That's probably not a gigantic surprise, but it is an incredible phone that packs pretty much everything you would want from a flagship device. And sort of the things that were holding it back in previous years are no longer holding it back. Samsung Unchained, so to speak. I love the phone. If you pick one up, I think you'll love it too.